Hi, I'm John Atack, and I'm extraordinarily pleased to have Hoyt Richards as my guest today. So we've talked through your experience and just some things that seem important to me. The first is that for me, the first part of recovery from such an experience is humility. It's accepting that you were fooled and that what you believed to be a genuine series of friendly relationships were actually a series of relationships that demanded your obedience, your submission to the will of another person.
You know, I love what someone very bright said one time. Uh, it's actually very easy to be conned, but it's very, very hard to admit you've been conned. And I think that's where the rubber meets the road, because I think we all get manipulated all the time. And that's where the humility comes in, like you're saying, to just admit that you got duped. And there's nothing wrong with that because it happens to all of us all the time. But there is such a resistance to that. And I've watched it certainly even within my group. Just to give you a number, which I find staggering, but it's probably pretty accurate to what happens in most of these high control group situations. I'd say out of the 100 people that were involved, 4 people can admit it was a cult and can even really know what that means and can talk about it on any level. So the 96% are still traumatized or in some form of denial or some sort of still true believer status of whatever. And that, I think, is probably a ratio that's more common than not.
And I think it's the society in which we live. I mean, Margaret Singer, calling her book Cults in Our Midst, the book she wrote with Jan Jelalic, said that what she was hoping that people would understand from that was that our society was cultic, that it is a series of overlapping cults. And I mean, in diving into that, I know various other people, my good friend Christian Sherko or Steve Hassan, we've all come to this word authoritarian. We played around with the word totalitarian quite a while. And then I started sort of going, well, it doesn't have to be total. Just the fact of somebody having authority over you that is unwarranted. And it made me distinguish between rank authority, where somebody's just your boss because they have a rank above you. They don't necessarily know anything. And real authority, which is where, if I want the plumbing fixing, a plumber will be the authority on that subject. And we have a society, in the West as bad as anywhere else, that is about obedience and authority. And it doesn't need to be. It's not healthy. Kids should, as my friend Ira Chaleff says, have intelligent disobedience. They should be able to say, that doesn't sound right to me. Could you explain it? And that's not the way our system works. So I think...
And I think one of the things you raise, which really resonates with me, is trying to develop a nomenclature that works for all of us, because I think semantics play a huge part into trying to talk about these subjects, and it's very problematic because, I mean, just the word cult is so triggering on some level. So obviously, because I've been in this recovery process for 20 plus years, it can fall quite flippantly off my tongue, but I have to catch myself sometimes, because to the uninformed, it's a very triggering word, because and I was one of those people too, in the sense that you immediately bring up the media and perspective of the worst case scenarios that are associated with that world, whether it's Jonestown, whether Heaven's Gate, Charlie Manson,
Solar Temple. There's a whole list of them.
Also, you drop the cult bomb, and so it's so the more accurate term is cultic relationship, but you're still using the word that's potentially triggering, but at least it's used in another way at least warrants some inquisition, rather than saying a word that someone's immediately going to go into a place of recognition, which may not be what you're actually describing. And then you're kind of, you're 2 steps deep in the hole that you have to dig out of just because you said the word.
Yeah, I mean, a very good example of this. I think every generation creates snarl words and purr words, things,
right.
you know, like the word appeasement, for example, which up until the late 1930s meant negotiation.
Right.
Now it's this horrible thing that you're not meant to do.
Right.
In our generation, a lot of terms that we use for mental illness became terms of abuse. So the term mongoloid was used for somebody with Down syndrome and became the word mong, which is, you know, a despicable term. I think
Right.
cult has suffered a similar fate, that it went, its real meaning is a group that is dedicated to an idea, a doctrine, or a person. That's it.
Right.
You know, it doesn't mean anything negative. It didn't mean anything negative until, I believe, the American Heritage Dictionary got hold of it and suddenly decided it had a negative connotation quite some time ago. Then during the 70s, with all the media, I mean, I remember first meeting Steve Hassan in '89 and him saying, we have to say destructive cult. You know, a cult is just a group of people doing something. It's destructive or dangerous. And we've kind of slipped out of that a little bit and got used to the media use of the word. And then people get very prickly and they get very upset. I mean, another word that I tend to step, you know, it's varied at different times in my life, but I don't tend to use the word hypnosis if I can avoid it, because everybody knows what it means. And I've met very few people who actually do understand that there is this hypnotic ability. There is this, which generally we use the term imagination. And in fact, one of the valid definitions of hypnosis is guided imagination. When somebody else is directing your imagination, that's hypnosis. But no swinging watches, what have you. So the terms are very important because often they're simply an obstacle to understanding.
Right. And that's where like the work in NLP comes up, right? Where they've learned the power of the words and how triggering that can be, and how you can guide someone in a conversation the way you want without them even knowing there's a influence and manipulation occurring.
I mean, the most startling example of that would be Milton Erickson's teaching stories. And of course, NLP derives ultimately from Bates and Erickson. There's nothing particularly original in it, other than the kind of malevolent attitude that many practitioners seem to have adopted, generating a dangerous cult in many places. But that Erickson, in reading his teaching stories, you know, somebody comes to him and they've got a problem and he tells them a story. And I read those stories, I can't find a single thread that makes sense to me of how it is that the person then leaves the room and they no longer have the problem. But apparently that was the case. And it can become that subtle that you can get into the language in somebody's head and get them to, well, George Orwell, the appendix to 1984, where he sort of says, well, you can't commit a thought crime anymore because you don't have the words to think it. So it is a very important aspect of you know, how we behave and how we believe, and pulling away and finding a better vocabulary, not using the word brainwashing, for example, which there's been such a fight about. Ben Zablocki was very keen on it. Alex Stein is very keen on it. Kathleen Taylor has used it, you know, a neurologist using it. The problem is it drags along with it such a bunch of shadows that
Yes, because listen, I mean, personally, that's kind of how I feel like would happen to me. And so I've used that word, you know. But it is, again, it's the effect that word has on whoever you're conversing with, and whether that's facilitating an understanding or whether it's actually pushing them away from actually the point you're trying to make. And I think this is the ongoing challenge we have, which can only get improved by having more conversations. I mean, that's, I think, you know, like one of the thrusts I feel like is by making it more universally understood that cultic relationships, or whatever way we end up calling them, are more universal, then it becomes more acceptable to talk about those relationships. Because it's just like the reason those cultic relationships have such a profound impact on so many people's lives is because they don't even diagnose it as such. Therefore, they don't recognize they've been wounded or even traumatized by that relationship, and don't recognize that potentially and more than likely they'll try to find another relationship similar to that, because that's what the psyche always does. If you haven't connected the dots, it tries to repeat the lesson in another term, hoping that maybe you'll connect the dots. And that's one of the reasons we go to therapy, is become conscious of unconscious patterns, where you start to go, oh, these situations or these relationships I get myself in, there's actually a pattern, there's a cycle, there's something happening that actually goes back to the initial wound. But if you're not diagnosing it correctly from the beginning, that's what can happen. And this is where these conversations, and I think the importance of recognizing that it really is common ground, and just because you or I went through the more extreme version of it doesn't mean what we learned, the lessons we learned and the tools we utilize to be able to get to the point where we can have that conversation potentially could be useful to a lot of others. And that's where I feel this arena, which has been kind of segmented to this thing of, oh, that happens to them, needs to move into, no, it's happening to all of us all the time. And it's not very hard to make the argument of what we see in our current events, whether it's politics, whether it's the military, whether it's advertising. I mean, you just see forms of manipulation all the time. And then obviously it's as we're talking about, it occurs in our personal lives constantly. So it's a much more profound and important subject than how it's been dealt with in the past. So just being this segment of what happens to those few unlucky, gullible types that just couldn't see straight, when it was happening.
And I think the reality is that undercutting that there are people who want and expect others to be obedient to them. Those people are classifiably Machiavellian. They have the narcissistic personality disorder. They're sociopaths. They're psychopaths. There are all sorts of borderlines. There are all sorts of classifications. I call them human predators, just because I'm not here to make a psychiatric evaluation. I'm here to try and protect people from predation. And so seeing that there are certain behaviors that are common to all of those types of people, that you can very readily teach people about. I mean, I get it down to, I think, about 40 minutes to teach somebody the basics of the human predator and how to recognize them. If somebody had explained that to me when I was at school, I would never have got involved with Scientology. But I think there's a problem in that much of our society depends upon authoritarianism, and it depends upon manipulation of one kind or another. That's my go-to word for all of this: manipulation, which means getting somebody to do something when you have a hidden agenda, when you're not going to tell them why you're doing it. And I think a lot of it's just a failure to understand that these problems are the most profound human problems. We are not going to maintain our environment until we stop fighting with each other. And we're not going to stop fighting with each other until we learn how to talk to each other. And the tools for that are all in the field in which we work. That it's about relationship, and it's about fanaticism and how that comes about. Fanaticism being the unwillingness to hear other people's opinions.
Oh, it's true. And you guided me towards that book On Being Certain, and
Robert A. Burton,
how useful that was. And then the work that Yuval's done as far as with awe. And I mean, that's such an important factor of it. And just for me, coming to learn and accept that human beings in general, we're predisposed to follow. And if you can't recognize, like, that's kind of your pre-wiring, and that the idea of becoming in any way a leader or a free thinker takes incredible vigilance and effort to work against that predisposed wiring, that you don't even know the battle that you're in, so to speak, and how you're so easily influenced or manipulated because of that pre-wiring. And And I think, you know, it comes back to, and I'd be curious about what you think about this. I mean, it would be great if our education system could just, I don't know whether it be like when kids are maybe 12, 13, 14, just a course that starts to teach them about these basic ideas, not only of the physiology and how the brain works, but these predispositions and just simple influence techniques. I mean, Cialdini's done such great work on his stuff that just would give you just a foundational roadmap to give you potential red flags that could serve you enormously in your life, just at that critical age when you are so impressionable and so, you know, and you're going through the hormone changes and all the things where you're just so easily flipping from one emotional state to another. And I think, you know, that knowledge, I don't see a downside, but you know, I guess there's always people that could abuse it. But I mean, I still think you're better off having it out there than having to find it like I did in my 40s and 50s after getting myself into quite a pickle, you know?
Yeah, I think it would be pretty straightforward. I personally think you start very early, and with the notion of intelligent disobedience, teaching kids that it's okay for them to express their opinions, it's okay for them to assert themselves, and, you know, to disagree agreeably. The Matthew Lipman method, the Socrates for 6-year-olds, where instead of cramming facts into somebody's head that they can then regurgitate, and, you know, I'm pretty good at regurgitating facts, but it doesn't impress me because Google usually can do a better job of it than I can. Wikipedia has some problems with contemporary cults, let's say, but apart from that, you know, encyclopedias have got that information. What's important is, can I think with the information? And my experience of school, both for myself and through my 4 children, my grandchild, is schools don't really have much to do with that. They're about socializing you into these unspoken patterns of conduct, whereby you're pretty much meant to do as you're told, and that's not actually useful. That you know, we want the most creative people in our society to be as creative as possible. We want ethical concerns to be an aspect of everything that we do. We've seen the world go rampant with you know, plutocratic capitalism, with this, you know, or its equivalent in communism, these ideas of creating control for a small group of individuals over the rest of us, and it's not worked. So I think intelligent disobedience is there at the beginning, and having schools that are more about having kids think and participate and collaborate. The competition is a reasonable thing, I accept that, but it's too much there's too much of an emphasis, which actually marks kids for life. You know, they weren't very good at stuff at school, and they therefore aren't very good at stuff. All sorts of things are wrong. You then have the notion, again from Ira Chalef, of courageous followership. But, you know, he can admit publicly now that yes, he was involved directly with Ron Hubbard many years ago. It's 40 years now since Ira left all of that. But he learned from observing the tyranny of Ron Hubbard. Hubbard was a man who loved screaming at people in their faces until they quivered and collapsed, which is not psychologically very good for us.
My leader was known for that too.
It's an aspect of narcissism, it would seem, that when they feel threatened, they have to make a lot of noise. And I think then, as you say, when you get to be 12 or 13, you should learn about relationship and how to communicate and how to resolve problems, you know, and how much our behavior is dependent upon what we think, and somehow creating a tolerance. I have a friend who's a secular humanist and who tells me that if we were all secular humanists, it would all be fine. I tend to think that if we all belonged to any group, it wouldn't be fine, that I am secular and I am a humanist, but I don't really want to belong to an organism, you know.
I am curious, after your experience, you're now 40 years out, I'm 20 plus years out. Are you reticent about group dynamics at this point in your life, or how do you kind of how do you perceive groups?
Yeah, I am. That's the truth of it.
Because I am, so I think it's hard not to. I will say, filmmaking is very much a team sport, and it's very much about building a group. But it's a shorter. There's a finite time that you're doing it, so it doesn't feel like as dangerous. So that has not been triggering to me, in the sense that I, especially if I'm one of the producers, and where I'm allowed to police the mentality of just teamwork versus egocentric, destructive behavior, and I just have zero tolerance with it. But it allows me to kind of do things on a group basis, because I think it is segmented and it's kind of within a short period. But the idea of actually getting involved with a group or a movement, boy, I just don't feel that. I just absolute caution and reticence with it.
And I think there's, I found, I now collaborate with many people all around the world, and nobody's my boss. And I do have an assistant, I admit, but she says I don't boss her around. Right. The thought for me, and it's the same thought I have as a parent, that my kids start out completely dependent. And the idea is that by the time they're, 59 or something, they'll be completely independent. I don't know where that age is. But the idea is it's meant to be around their majority, somewhere between 18 and 21. But the thought is that the graph is always going towards them taking responsibility for themselves, learning how to cut their own fingernails, having learned how to blow their own noses, and, step by step. And I think that what's been exciting for me over the, and I've had 37 years of collaborating with other individuals post-cult. I wasn't a living member of the cult, so I had a fairly easy time there as well. Right. But I absolutely rejoice in the networking that I do, the little projects that I do with people, right, because everybody has their own authority still. There is no bullying. There is no, we're going to do this my way, because, everything can be resolved, and you can get to a point where a group of people can work together, and it's a delight, right, not a pressure.
I agree. I mean, I think, one of the things that I've come to realize more recently is there's such a difference between the mentor-mentee relationship versus the guru-devotee relationship. Yes. Right?
Yeah.
And because now that I'm, in my 50s, approaching 60, I find that I very appealing to see someone younger than me who shows tons of ambition and potential and things, and if somehow they see me as a resource, and I see them as someone who, if maybe given some guidance and some tools that I wish I had at that age, could actually go on and do greater things than even I did, just because I didn't know those things at that time. It's very much kind of like, because I also at times I coach actors, and a lot of times the acting coach dynamic is incredibly codependent and destructive. But usually I come from the point of view of I'm happy to show you what I know and what I've learned, but all with the premise that I'm going to help you build your wings so that you can fly. You won't need me anymore. Now, if you want to just have dialogue and bounce things off, that's great. But the destructive acting coach relationship I had is, no, I hold the wings. and when I think you're ready, I'll let you use them from time to time, but but I get them back after that time because they're very dangerous and I need to watch after them. And you may left by yourself, you might do something really, really awful. And that's very much a control tactic. And it's like, oh, you'll do fine as long as you know I'm your secret weapon. And that's not doing anybody any benefit. And that's much more the guru devotee type approach. Whereas I think the mentor is really, if reached in a healthy environment, is, you want to see that person excel and go and do things beyond what you even did. And that's even more exciting than anything.
It is. And again, it comes down to humility. It comes down to how much we're willing to let other people shine. Right. And there's very much the thing in a cultic relationship that everything is flows to truth.
Yeah.
I think I'm looking for, here it is, Thinking in Education. This is Matthew Lippman, and he has a little bunch of paradigms that he puts forward, which I think are really incredibly relevant to, the way we behave and do things. So he says, in standard education consists in the transmission of knowledge from those who know to those who don't know. And he offers the alternative. Education is the outcome of participation in a teacher-guided community of inquiry, among whose goals are the achievement of understanding and good judgment. Then the second one is knowledge is about the world, and our knowledge of the world, it's unambiguous, unequivocal, and unmysterious. Students are stirred to think about the world when our knowledge of it is revealed to them to be ambiguous, equivocal, and mysterious. The third premise is knowledge is distributed among disciplines that are non-overlapping and together are exhaustive of the world to be known. So you wouldn't want to confuse geography and history, or literature. Right. The disciplines in which inquiry occurs are assumed to be neither non-overlapping nor exhaustive. Hence, their relationships to their subject matters are quite problematic. So we move between subjects, which always made sense to me. The teacher plays an authoritative role in the educational process, but only if teachers know can students learn what they know. The teacher's stance is fallibilistic, one that is ready to concede error rather than authoritative. Then 5, which is the last of the educator's points, students acquire knowledge by absorbing information. Id est data about specifics. An educated mind is a well-stocked mind. And he has 2 points from there. Students are expected to be thoughtful and reflective, and increasingly reasonable and judicious. And the focus of the educational process is not on the acquisition of information, but on the grasp of relationships within and among the subject matters under investigation. And I think he pretty much nails it,
Yeah, he does. And because it's really, and maybe it's unfair to distill it down to this, but it's all about facilitating critical thinking, right? And embracing that and encouraging that, and letting someone in their youth realizing that ultimately that's their greatest asset, and that it's something to be aware of because it can be influenced or taken from them, and if they don't know about certain things that are out there. And I think I don't think I would know really about critical thinking if I hadn't gone through what I went through. So I feel again, it's I wish others didn't have to learn it the way I did.
That right? Is the point, isn't it? I mean, I'm very glad that I had the experience of Scientology. It's just that it should have taken 3 weeks rather than 9 years. And it then shouldn't have taken me 7 years beyond that to work out how on earth, because for me, leaving was easy. I realized that Ron Hubbard was a liar, and he had constructed a road to truth. And that was enough of a conflict for me. It took some weeks, but I came away from it. What I could not understand was why 98% of the people I talked to, or maybe it's your 96%, but a very high proportion of people were, yeah, sure, he was a liar, but this is a brilliant technology. You're going,
Right.
this man said honesty is sanity. What did he just tell you? And it's like that need to believe. Why was that so powerful in people? So we've both worked on a few documentaries over the years, and
Yeah.
I think we've both been disappointed.
Yes.
My first experience of the media with regard to cults was a Daily Mail journalist in March 1984, and he stopped me talking, and people do occasionally, and he said, "John, you haven't understood. I want a victim and a picture." And that pretty much defined my experience over the next 37 years of the media, with some rare and wonderful exceptions. I have worked with a couple of producers who really did want to do something. But the problem usually ends up being, here's a victim, here's the picture, here's the story, and you wouldn't be stupid enough to get involved in this now, would you?
Yeah.
So some reflections perhaps upon that process.
Well, I think living what I went through, which in many ways felt like a movie, to then come out of that and then end up going into the storytelling business wasn't by chance, in the sense that to make sense of what my own personal experience was, I became fascinated with the story dynamic of, I don't know if you're familiar with the hero's journey and those type of things.
I'm horribly familiar. I've read a dozen of Campbell's books.
Right. Yeah. So Joseph Campbell's was a real sense of solace for me, because
me too.
The idea that you go through these these tribulations and turmoil to have the third act climax of some epiphany of some level, awakening. This is where the transformation occurs. But then what he talks about as well is then taking that elixir and going back to the community with it. There's this aftermath of where you take the new perspective and you share it with your loved ones and community. And that part just seems, when it comes to documentaries on the subject matter, that gets abandoned. And even worse than that, I would say the most common faux pas and atrocity on some level is, more often than not, they're taking the antagonist, which is the cult leader, and making them the protagonist.
Yes.
So instead of taking the person that would be more relatable, which in this case would be the victim, the focus has always been like, oh, I want to know about the sociopath and the narcissistic personality. What makes them tick? And listen, granted, it is fascinating without question, but that is train wreck entertainment. And I hope that as an audience, you're not finding a lot of relatability to that cult leader, because that's a really, really dangerous personality. I mean, you're literally looking at a serial killer type personality. So I understand the attraction to it, because it's very salacious and it's the obvious low-hanging fruit. But as a storytelling mechanism, it's completely backwards, serves no benefit, and never gets you to that point of an awakening and then an awareness that becomes the elixir that you carry away, this feeling of hope and understanding that there was a purpose to this journey, that you ate the shit burgers in order to learn what you needed to learn, and now you're given the elixir. So if you don't do that, then what's the point of telling the story? Other than to really just depress people. And of course, the worst part of it, it's not accurate to what can and does happen. You and I being cases of that. So I think that's where I get frustrated, because I think and recently there have been some better stories being told this way. Most recently was the NXIVM stories that were handled on HBO and also Stars. And I actually think they complemented each other quite well, because the HBO show dealt with really making it clear how you get pulled in and how seductive it was. Because like the first episode is basically selling, it was called The Vow, and it's basically selling all the pitch that the NXIVM group gave, and even being an ex-cult member, I'm watching going, sounds pretty cool to me. I think I'd like to take that test. I'm like, then that's exactly what you need. You need someone to say, oh, I could see how I could be interested in this, because that builds the empathy. That builds the connection to, oh, this could happen to me. Because I think that's the biggest obstacle we face. And that's what I faced in my own life, of thinking like, can't be a cult because I'm in it. The group is you would never be a cult because someone like me doesn't join the group.
I'm vulnerable. I'm sensible. I see what's going on. And that actually pulls us to, that is the great hurdle. How do you get over the fact that this is invisible to the individual? And I think it's invisible for a very practical reason, that if I, as an individual, questioned my perception and my interpretation of my perception, I wouldn't be able to move around in the world.
Right.
I think is it sea siphons? There's some creature that in its larval stage, it swims around, then it attaches itself to a rock, and the first thing it does is eat its brain. And I've heard this said of PhDs who become professors,
Right.
that you attach yourself to the institution, you don't need to think anymore. But therefore, this notion that the brain is there so that we can move, and what happens is that we paralyze ourselves because we have to believe our perception, our interpretation. Now, it's pretty obvious that our perception compared to a dog or a whale is pathetic. It's just awful. We can hear about 100th of what they can hear. Right. Our vision is not tremendously good, though it's better than my cat's, apparently.
Right.
Who can only see in 2 colors, I'm told. Dead and live, so our perception is really not great, and we then fill in and interpret. And our interpretation, well, nobody really, we talk about critical thinking, and I'd just like to point out this critical feeling that we cannot just become thinking machines. We're not capable of it, and our thoughts and our feelings are never separate.
Yeah. Never. Well, and I think, and that's why I love that, the on being certain, where you realize that feeling of certainty is a feeling. Like it's not an analytical thing that your brain like, da 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 da, and you get to hear. It's like, no, it's in my gut. I feel it. I know it, and how intoxicating that is. And then misdiagnosing where that's coming from and putting it in the category of rational analytical thought. And so it's this constant intertwining, and it's one of the things that I try to relay to people. I go, being in a cult was awful, but in many ways it was also pretty simple. Like you've been captured in black and white thinking, and which is one of the most controlling ways you can work with anyone. And from that point of view, either what you're doing is right or wrong, and there's rules kind of establishing what's right or wrong. Now, granted, the rules continue to change, which is another story, but there are rules, and you're still be following them. So either you're abiding or you're not. So either you're in the graces or you're in trouble. And from that point of view, it's awful in the sense that you're on eggshells all the time and wanting not to be in trouble. But things are fairly simple and from that lens. Now, when you come through that and recognize it was all a massive manipulation, and have to kind of start to make sense of how did that happen, and how did I get involved, how did I allow it to go on, and all the suppressed feelings I had of literally just wanting to tell people to just fuck off, and that I just suppressed because I didn't want to be in trouble, and all those emotional things, and the feeling of humility of allowing things to happen, and feeling like I had been hoodwinked and duped, and the embarrassment. And it wasn't until I was able to kind of understand the things we talked about earlier about the brain physiology and things that more or less anyone who found themselves in the same circumstances that I found myself would more or less done the same thing. Yep. So it wasn't that my parents didn't love me enough, or didn't say they loved me, or didn't, that I was, somehow brain damaged, or just incredibly naive or gullible. Those things aren't really, mind control works on everybody. You just have to be receptive.
Techniques are applied to you that mean you can't think straight.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't think straight when you can't think straight.
That's right. And that's right.
That's
And
true for any of us. We can all get spaced out. We can all get dissociated. We can all get bored to death to the point where we can't think anymore.
right,
And
right.
make sense of it. I had a tremendous example of what you're saying when I first talked with Mike Rinder a few months ago. And Mike was 20 years running harassment for Scientology.
Yeah,
So he was one of the people he harassed. And he's a lovely guy. But he said that when he sat down with me in 94, 95, or whenever it was, when they all came over to crush me completely, that, you know, he could see I was a decent, pleasant sort of fellow, but that was irrelevant because I had to be destroyed because I was opposing mankind's only hope. Now, for me, the kind of means and ends have to be the same thing. And that's been my way all my life. You know, I've been lucky. I haven't done anything at all that I look back on and go, oh dear, you know, that was really, because the means and the ends are the same. But to separate those things and say, well, I'm afraid, you know, we're going to have to kill off all the Jewish people, or, you know, all the Tutsi, or the Cambodians, because sadly they are vermin. And for the progress of humanity, they have to be exterminated. And you see whole populations, you know, we talk about this, you know, being relevant to everyone. We see whole populations. Look at North Korea, for example, where the population is just under the spell, the dark spell of some awful, lying human being who, you know, is perpetuating a mythology, a set of fairy tales. In terms of the hero journey, what we tend to see is we get as far as the castle where the Fisher King is wounded. And that's the bit everybody's interested in. They want to see the wound being inflicted. They don't want the holy grail of the elixir to find out. And that would require a certain amount of engagement. You can't just drink it from the cup. You have to realize the elixir. You know, you have to work on it.
And that brings up a great point that I'd love to ask you about, because this is one of the shortcomings of the NXIVM documentaries that came out recently. And I would also want to ask you about Mike Rinder and Leah Remini's stuff, because I think when you're dealing with something that's so current, you know, which is meaning that it's in the media because it's so relevant, because it just happened shortly a time ago, but it doesn't allow for the recovery process to have even occurred yet. So this is where you're immediately at a shortcoming where, yes, you can address a lot of these things that we're talking about, but you're at such an early stage of the recovery, there's no perspective to really self-reflect and gain, like we're talking about, the elixir where you can really look back on it in a way that can kind of provide the hope. And you find that, because I know from my personal journey, I was fortunate in the sense that the group was small enough that when I went through the awakening of realizing all those feelings of suppression, of anger and frustration and resentment of taking all that abuse for so many, you know, decades, that I wanted to lash out and destroy them. You know, the idea is, I don't want this to happen to anyone else, which sounds great and all of that. But the truth is, the more important thing is, that's what the group taught you to do. Like, don't worry about your own, you know, health and well-being, and, you know, no, go on the attack and basically take what the group taught you and use it against them now to try to take them down. But which is fine. But ultimately, what the more important thing is, how are you doing from all of this? How's that process going? And I think it's very easy, especially, you know, with something like Scientology, where it's very hard to take down, that you can get lost into, I'm just going to take my Scientology lessons and play it back and go against them in what they use their own armor against them, you know, their own weapons against them, and try to take them down, and potentially avoid dealing with the more important issue of, how are you doing?
Yeah, I mean, there's a halfway.
So I'm curious, talking to someone like Mike, you know, whether you feel he's making progress in that area, because it just takes time. It's still pretty recent from the time he's gotten out, and it's great that he's brought awareness to this group and done some really damning exposés of what goes on inside. But having met him now and talked to him, how do you feel he's kind of moving on the recovery path?
Well, I think he's doing very well, but it's about 15 years now since he left.
Okay, good. Yeah.
I agree with you. The process takes as long as it takes. It depends on how immersed you were, and it depends on how resilient you are. It's reckoned there's a small proportion of people, about 15% of people, who don't get post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, I will count myself among those people because I really didn't have PTSD when I left Scientology. I realized later that I may have been one of the very few people who didn't, because most people were abused and humiliated and their lives were devastated. I was very lucky because there's a policy in Scientology towards celebrities, and you are, even if, as I was, you're not making any money by being an artist or a writer, what have you, you are still considered a celebrity. And so there were kid gloves, there was special treatment, which I didn't realize at the time. And I certainly didn't know about any of the atrocities or any of the horrors in the 9 years I was involved. And I think that was my main driving force for what I did afterwards, because I felt ashamed that I hadn't known about these things. The people on a rice and beans diet for 6 months, we were being chucked off a ship into the Mediterranean by the great Lord and Master. These things embarrassed me, and I didn't want, I know that the worst thing anybody can say about me is that I used to believe in Scientology, but I was not a total convert. I was not fully immersed. There was no point where I was twice shouted at or shouted back.
You weren't on the Sea Org, huh?
Exactly. I wasn't on staff either. I wasn't in one of the missions. I wasn't working for them. And so, I had a relatively easy experience. Then I was harassed for 16 years solid, pretty much on a daily basis, involving, I don't know how many court cases. That's how bad it got. I was sued in America and here. And I tried to fight back, which was foolish, frankly, given the way the court system works. We had a review of the court system shortly after I lost an action, where Lord Justice Wolfe said, it is the case in English justice that he with the deepest pockets wins. And in America, doubly so.
Absolutely.
So, but then I should have developed post-traumatic stress disorder, because everything fell apart. My health came apart. My marriage came apart. A friend sued me, close friend sued me. People started queuing up to write affidavits against me, which was kind of weird. Bearing in mind that Scientology has a huge intelligence apparatus at work in the background. And I was assessed, I think it was 1996, I was assessed for PTSD and told I didn't have it. So it can happen. You can get incredibly lucky. And that's all I can say it was in my case. It was luck, nothing else, that you'll be resilient. But 85% of people won't be. And when they go through trauma, it will resonate, and it will take, you talked about the sensitivity of your friend Fabio not asking you what the problem was. Now, Ronnie Janoff Bullman, in her wonderful book, Shattered Assumptions, it's a classic about PTSD, she talks about denial being a protective mechanism and saying it's not a matter of pushing somebody through it. It's a matter of, letting them move through it.
Yes.
What I see in the ex-cult movement, and I don't consider I've ever been part of the counter-cult movement, by the way, 37 years on, people have called me an anti-Scientologist. When I was involved with that, I was a very pro-Scientologist. I was doing everything I could to help them. So that's never really seemed to be central to me. But there are a lot of people who are. And what they want to do is they're acting out something that's wrong with them. So my great friend Carlos Cornier, he was on the Rehabilitation Project Force in Florida many years ago in the 80s. Mm-hmm. And so he's been reduced to the lowest. He's in the labor camp, the gulag. He has to eat table scraps. He doesn't have a mattress to sleep on. He can't talk to anybody without being talked to. He's being put through something that could be called a brainwashing program if one compared it to the Mao Zedong's Sinao program in China. And he's there doing that, and some protesters come along, and one of them spits at him. Now, that to me exemplifies this unhealed mess that people get into, where they think that by attacking the members of the group, who are the victims of the group,
right,
they will somehow be triumphant and good and virtuous, which is, as you say, very much the attitude of the black and white thinking attitude of the group. The thing is, what can we do to help? And yeah, people who are still smarting over it. I used to have people coming up to me all the time saying, could they help me do what I was doing? And I asked them what they wanted to do. And in 90% of cases, they wanted to hurt somebody. You know, they wanted to get their own back. It was like, there's no place for revenge in this work at all if you're going to be successful. But there are a lot of people in the counter-cult world who are that way inclined, and they then get into fights with each other. You know, that they've got a little bit of the doctrine they still believe in, and you're evil, and oh God.
It's true. I mean, I watch how hard it is in the so-called cult survivor world to build any real cohesion amongst the survivors, because it's just really challenging, right? I mean, it's hard.
And they're divided worlds. If you look at the ex-Jehovah's Witnesses, who are probably the largest of the communities that we would call cultic communities.
Right.
So, I'm not so sure about a Catholic Church recently. We've just had horrific news about them murdering babies in Ireland. You know, I mean,
with you on that one, John. Absolutely.
I'm going off it, you know. So they may be the largest cult in the world. But nonetheless, with the ex-Jehovah's Witness community, I have had dealings with quite a lot of former members of the Watchtower, and it saddened me how much animosity there is between the distinct groups. You know, you have the militant atheists who want to persuade everybody that as long as they stop believing in Jesus, it'll all be all right. And it's like, well, no, really, there's a bit of a deeper problem here about the way authority is treated within this group, the way that children are abused, you know, whether it be the sexual abuse with their list of 23,000 known offenders. The Watchtower is said to hold this list, or the factual treatment of children in the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is there's no need to get an education because, hey, the end of the world's round the corner. You have to be absolutely obedient. They will beat their children in a kingdom hall if a child makes too much noise. They're taken into a back room and beaten so the rest of the congregation can hear them yelling. Suffer the little children to come unto me, I think the man who started it all said. Not an opinion they've stayed with. But people come away from that and they Robert Kaufman, when he wrote the wonderful book Inside Scientology, he was a crazy bloke, and what can I say? I enjoyed the letters that we exchanged. But he, at the end of his book, he says, so I left the crazy science fiction world of Scientology and entered the crazy science fiction world of reality. And that's the bit that people mistake, that it's like, society is completely sane. You were in a cult group. It's like, yeah, really? Did you know anything about Lehman Brothers or Bear Stearns there?
Yeah,
cult groups, you know? So,
because I think the more rational experience, and I've shared this with other people, is not only do you come to the awareness of what you were involved with, which is of course a sobering moment, but then once you've gone through something like that, then you see aspects of it all around you in the world. It's not like you come out of it like, oh, the world's safe now. It's like, oh my God, this is going on all over the place. That was my awakening. Like, wow, this is really a global issue. Like this is not something that just was existing compartmentalized in my little vacuum, not at all. And that's a very sobering thought, you know.
Yeah, we've yet to have a sane generation of humans anywhere on this earth. I think that there's been something close to it in places. We look back and there's the Indus Valley civilization where for 700 years, these people didn't fight wars. They didn't have temples and they didn't have palaces. They seem to have got on with each other, but we don't know anything more than that. You know, so that's a bit frustrating. But that we are living in a world, where the dynamics are wrong. In terms of, what I've said to documentary makers for I don't know how many decades now is there are 4 areas that interest me. If you're willing to touch on any one of them, I won't charge you any money. That's a bad mistake of mine, by the way.
Right.
The first is, how is somebody recruited? How are they seduced into this relationship?
Right.
What's going on there? The second is, why do they carry on with this relationship? It is very much like domestic abuse, where somebody, the partner's being beaten up and they're saying, no, but he or she loves me.
The reasons why they stayed, right?
Yeah. Then why did they leave, if they did leave? And finally, and I think we agree, most importantly, how did they recover, if they have recovered? Now, we saw something. Were you in the room when Naomi Gibbons gave her talk about NXIVM?
Yes.
I was furious. They gave me a release form to sign afterwards, and I was like, there's no way that I'm going to be associated with what you've just done. This poor woman who has never spoken publicly is now talking about having grown up in the children of God and being abused, and then being a NXIVM and being abused, and watching her break down on stage and saying, this is television. This is, there's no heart in this. That,
this is not the forum where this should be happening. And certainly, again, like I said, she was just on the beginning, the cusp of her just figuring things out. And as I have learned, you can intellectually process stuff fairly fast. Like, you can connect the dots and say the words and say, okay, this is what happened. The emotional processing of that wound, I'm talking years, if not decades. That's been my experience. So to put someone in, in a situation like that is so potentially re-triggering and re-traumatizing. It just, the benefit does not in any way usurp the potential damage. And again, it's people not understanding. Like you can see the producer Hollywood point of view of like, oh, this will be great, but again, it's not and that's why, until it starts getting told differently, because as I was telling a person I've been working with, telling my story, is ultimately I'm hoping this will be a case study in trauma, because in the sense of, how does it, just like how does it happen? How do you stay in the situation? How do you finally get if you choose to deal with it, what happens? And if you choose not to deal with it, what happens? I go, and our group is very much a case study of that, of if you choose to deal with it, you end up in this very small category, but people who can talk about it in a certain way. And then other people who are still loyalists and hoping that maybe they'll come talk about it. I mean, it's one of these things I have mixed feelings, because it breaks my heart that these people are still in that place. But as a teaching tool, I'm like, give them the forum to talk about what they want at this stage, hoping that maybe even they, when they see the whole thing put together, will go, oh, but you don't know. But it's a tricky thing, but it needs to be dealt with in that way of you need to show that there's different routes to deal with trauma. The most common one is maybe denial or just avoidance, but there are alternatives, and hopefully people like ourselves, being able to talk about it, helps illuminate that to some degree. That's kind of where I feel strongly about. Yeah,
and I'm confident that what we do does make a difference, because I've had enough feedback over the years from people. And it's the long-term ones. I frequently boast about a letter I received which said, we met 15 years ago, you probably don't remember me. And to my shame, I don't. I spent an afternoon with this woman. She said, her life was in turmoil. And that afternoon, that was the point where something in her catalyzed and she was able to go on, which is, that's her process. I had the privilege of participating in that process. That's all there is to it. It wasn't something I did. It was a place I was. But she was now, she'd had a happy marriage, had children, she had a career, and she was looking back 15 years and saying, that was a moment when it changed. And knowing that what we do can be that potent occasionally makes it absolutely all worthwhile.
Absolutely. Absolutely. No, because and it comes back to the humility thing. It's like, I'm not going to impart this information saying you need to do what I did, but I'm going to impart this information from the point of view of saying, this is what I did and it helped me. And this is the information I sought out. This is what I discovered. You know, I can only talk about it from what my own personal experience has been, but give it away from the point of view of maybe you'll find some of this information useful or it resonates with you on some level. But as we just talked about, then it's up to that person. It's the old, you can't take the horse to the water and make it drink. I mean, but we can at least get the information out there. And that's kind of where I would love to facilitate, just to, making the information more accessible, and then making it cool to talk about your cultic relationship, because we've all had them, so it's no longer something that needs to be taboo or segmented to a certain small percentage of our society. It's really, truly a universal issue.
And Mark Laxer has put up the "I got out" hashtag for people who want.
Yeah, right.
And the years went by, and I kind of went, actually, what we really need is a preventative. We really need to change some of these fundamental ideas in our society about responsibility, about communication. And I'm very happy that there's Ken Robinson, the educator, has written a couple of books, The Elements, Creative Schools, which show that there are hundreds of schools around the world that are actually adopting a far more sensible curriculum, which will help people develop into adults. I mean, I've become greatly enamored of the work of Eric Fromm over the last several years. And it was funny because I picked up a copy of The Art of Loving that was on my shelf and reread it, and realizing it was absolutely packed with notes all the way through. I'd read it 30 years before. And here was this book, which was basically agreeing with most of what I think. And these are thoughts I thought I'd come to. So I went off and read 5 more of his books. And some of it, I mean, he's a homophobic, which was typical at that time. And that's just, that shouldn't be forgiven. It's a stupid thing.
Right.
And some of what he believes about the way that a society and the individual, this kind of holon idea of you just scale up, it's not true. In the same way it's not true in physics that there are 3 worlds in physics: the micro, the meso, and the macro, and they seem to work on different rules. I think the same is true with individuals and societies, that we shouldn't try and force those ideas. Fromm did a little bit. That was in the 50s. But he has certain fundamental ideas which, to me, every child should learn. For example, he talks about people being life-denying or life-affirming, and says, you can be a different degree of each in different parts of your life. But it's a very interesting way to look at people, to say, to what extent is this person actually denying life? To what extent are they harming themselves and others? And to what extent could they be made more life-affirming? How could we help them to have a better opinion of themselves, for example? I mean, one of the areas that my friend Christian Schurker and I have talked about is how you rescue cult leaders. And this seems to be a thought that doesn't seem to have actually occurred to many people, that they might need some help too. And that by pulling them, he has successfully talked a couple of people out of forming cults over the years. So he has some direct experience of it. Remarkable man.
Well, that's fascinating, because you think of someone with potentially narcissistic personality disorder is unwilling to admit in every way that they might have a flaw, that they might be that's always the big obstacle. I mean, any normal kind of therapy, you have to admit you have a problem, and those people very often can't admit those things.
And I think with all the personality disorders, that's why they're kind of separated off from mental illnesses, because the idea is if you just realized what was wrong with you, it wouldn't be wrong with you. I do take issue actually with the standard idea about narcissism. I think it's absolutely the wrong word, because there is nothing narcissistic about narcissists. They are not people who sit gazing in the mirror and thinking how wonderful they are. They're people who sit in front of an audience going, oh, I hope they like me. You know, it's about adulation. It's not about narcissism at all.
Yeah. No, I mean, and again, this comes back to the topic we talked about earlier, trying to find the most competent nomenclature for the things we're discussing, so that we don't re-trigger things that actually aren't portraying an accurate picture of what we're trying to talk about. Right?
Yeah.
And it's a constant challenge.
It is. And I say, I think it happens with every generation. We have to rethink. You know, the word narcissist, I've done a little work on this, was introduced by the English psychologist Havelock Ellis. It was then picked up by Freud. And Freud said, this is somebody who loves only themselves. Well, in this and just about everything else he said, Freud was wrong. There is no evidence to support his ideas. He just dreamed them up while taking huge amounts of cocaine, frankly. And that's not really a good form of insight. And by his own terms, he was intensely narcissistic. But Fromm comes along, having studied Freud and started to rebel right at the early stages back in 1929, was in the Berlin Psychoanalytic Institute. And he started saying, this isn't right. And the first idea he put forward was, no, a narcissist is somebody who has no love. They don't know how to love. And he then talks about the pseudo self, this idea in the 1940s. He's saying, oh, people don't grow up. They don't become adult. They don't become fully functioning. They're like, well, what do you think I should do? Or, you know, what kind of car should I be driving to keep up with the Joneses? And that he saw that as the foundation of Nazism in his great book, Escape from Freedom. But I think he actually touched on something far more general. And he's saying probably about 2/3 of people never develop a self. So
now, would you say, would that be saying when you don't develop the self, you do not develop the ability to empathize? Is that kind of where direction it's going?
I think it's a part of it, because you don't, you know, for me, it's very, the notion of self-love is a very difficult notion for me. And this idea that you've got to love yourself before you can love others, I'm not sure we're actually dealing with the same fabric here. But Craig Malkin, the Harvard Medical School expert on narcissism, says that his spectrum is a spectrum of feeling special. So at 0, you have egoism, where you don't feel special at all. At 10, narcissism, where you feel too special. And in the middle, you have what he calls healthy narcissism, which to me is like healthy paranoia, or, you know, I can't fit those words together. There's nothing healthy about being narcissistic. It also, as my friend Jessica Turville points out, mean you could be a healthy egoist too, you know, and I don't think either of these things happen. But that he breaks it down, this great expert, narcissism is feeling special. It's self-worth. And I think that you have to have some sense of your own worth before you can truly understand the worth of other human beings.
Oh, exactly. I mean, and along those lines of thinking, is there such a thing as healthy manipulation?
Well, it's like, is there such a thing as sincere flattery? And unfortunately, the word flattery means insincere.
Yeah, right. I mean, it's tricky stuff, right? I mean, it's I don't know. I know it's tough stuff, but it's fascinating.
I think that the self develops, you know, the Romans apparently reckon that adulthood began at the age of 32. So I've been told, and that's way too early. Somewhere in your 80s, I think, probably, I'd reckon, maybe, if you're lucky. But the sense that you are a self, that sense of that you are your own parent, that's one of the ways it's put by some people, that you can comfort yourself, that you can be independent. But beyond that, because those things, psychopaths tend to be pretty autonomous.
Right.
we generate interdependence, we generate connectivity. I, from the age of 17 well into my 50s, all the way through Scientology, believed in enlightenment. I believed in satori, samadhi, moksha, whatever word we want for it. And it was only in my 50s, so long away from any, I left, I was 28 when I left Scientology. And I'd not involved myself in any other groups or with any other gurus, other than through literature, obviously, where the text is guru, as Lifton rightly puts it. But it fell away from me. I kind of went, that would be complete emotional equanimity. It would be a serenity, knowing that all of these things happen. As Lao Tzu says, the Tao is nature is ruthless because it knows everything dies. The sage is ruthless because he knows everything dies. It's like, I don't want to be ruthless. I want to be, I want to have the feelings that are appropriate. I don't want to be overwhelmed by it. I want to be able to do something to help despite how I feel. But it's okay to be sad. It's okay to be anxious. It's okay to be annoyed.
That's why I like this term, emotional intelligence, where you learn to navigate not only your own emotions but others when you're communicating with them, so that you're able to juxtapose between empathy and then also maintaining boundaries that you have, being able to be transparent, and forthcoming, and then also knowing there's other places that you need to protect and guard, and those are just things we learn as we go along the way, and I think in that area we're just all a work in progress, but I think it's a powerful tool to say emotional intelligence is something that really benefits us.
And I think everything is relationship. That's what I've come to, that I am one node in a network of relationships. And I can function well if I help others when they're having difficulty. And I can function well if I allow others to help me when I'm having difficulty. My emotional autonomy, not having my emotions controlled by somebody from the outside, is very important. And I've throughout my life made relationships with people who were negative towards me, frankly. I've also made relationships with people who were positive towards me, and I've helped psychopaths. It's happened along the way. That wasn't a good idea, but my emotional autonomy is such that I am happy in my relationships. I have good relationships with my family, with my kids, and with my adopted siblings, of whom you've become one, my friends. And when they need me, I'm here, and when I need them, they're there, and that works for me. I suppose it's more Asian than European concept that I see myself as a thread in a tapestry. I'm no longer desperate to be an ego, to be a soul, a spirit.
I love the tapestry metaphor, and it's one of the things when I'm in the position of coaching an actor about dialogue. You're given a scene and you're trying to figure out how to say your line to whoever you're talking to, and the most crucial thing I'm always saying is it's all based on your relationship, because ultimately what you're saying is not nearly important as how you're saying it. So it can, the term, even as something as simple as "I love you," how you would say that to your mother, to your father, to your friend, to your enemy, to your whatever the relationship will color everything so much that will dictate why you're saying these words, and we need to feel that in the way you express it, and that, so it's not what you're saying, it's how you're saying it, and who you're saying it to. That will ultimately allow us to understand the story, and because you get the average actor who's like, oh, doesn't it sound good if I say it like this? And I'm like, well, that's in a vacuum. Like, it doesn't. Who are you saying it to? What's the relationship there? But it really is. It gets distilled down into something that's simple from a certain point of view. relationship is paramount, you know.
Yeah, and again with art, you know, as a painter, long ago, while I was still involved with Scientology, determined that art is something that happens at the interface between the spectator, the viewer, and the piece. It's not something that happens in me that I put into a canvas. It's something that they will take from it and interpret. And it means that I absolutely accept that there are some people who think my work is utterly insignificant. It's good, actually. We were using a backdrop for many of our YouTubes, and it's a big painting, and this guy wrote in and said, "Why do you have blind man's wallpaper behind you?" What a wonderful title. So he explained to this poor man, who may well be watching today, that it was in fact a painting. and we then put it up whole so he could have a look at it, you know. But it doesn't bother me what people think about what I do, because you know, some people like it, some people don't.
Right.
And that's an aspect of relationship, accepting everybody else's taste is perfect.
Right.
The music they listen to, the food they like, is perfect for them.
Okay.
I don't have, although of course deep down inside I know, I don't have superior taste to anybody, because my taste is down to my you know, my sense receptors, and so it's personal to me. And I encourage people, that's the other part of becoming adult. As an artist, I encourage people to discover their own voice. What do you like? What are your color preferences? Not what are you going to sell to somebody, but find out what you really, really like. And that's how you become Rembrandt. That's how you become Francis Ford Coppola or whatever, that you say, no, that's not for me. This is for me. Develop your own voice. Develop yourself as an individual. Develop your own self and your own preferences. While also, of course, paying heed to people who know what they're talking about, because when you close yourself off at all.
I still, I mean, I think so much of here I am 20 years out, but I still deal with aspects of that people-pleasing persona of really wanting to take cues from someone else as to how I need to appear so that they will like me, you know, and realize that how counterproductive that is, but how it's such a tough thing to kind of manage and keep on top of and monitor, because it was second nature for so long. You know, I had a mother who also had you know, personality issues like that, you know, because of her issues of abandonment with her dad or whatever. So she fostered quite codependent relationships in our family, and so it just started very early, that idea that I need to become who you want me to be so that you'll like me, and that's a ongoing battle.
And I think the thing is that you know, most of the people I see, and I've now seen thousands coming out of authoritarian groups, there's this sort of presumption that they were fine, then they got in this group and it messed them up.
Right.
Well, the reality is none of us is fine. All of us.
We all come in with a bag. Yeah, exactly. No one gets a free lunch, right? It's
And there's another, you know, I'm a people pleaser. You know, I can't stand it if anybody's upset in the room, whether I upset them or not. I want them to feel all right. However, there is another way of looking at that, and that is that one is an empath. One is empathetic. Now, I test, you know, super empath. I disagree with one of Baron Cohen's questions, which is where he says that you're empathetic if you do most of the talking. You talk about yourself rather than listening to the other person. That doesn't seem to me to be empathetic at all. I think the man's an idiot. You know, you want to hear somebody else's story. And you want to share yours with them. Empathy runs both ways. What I realized on doing that test a few years ago was that it's a disorder. It's not a choice on my part, and that I have to go against that. And I have to say that there's, I think it's Paul Bloom at Yale wrote a book called Against Empathy. And it's subtitled The Argument for Rational Compassion.
I think I have it. I haven't read it yet. Yes, I have it.
Well, I think the idea is pretty simple. It's one of those books that's told you in the title what's going on, that the kind of knee-jerk empathetic reaction that you and I both suffer from isn't actually necessarily good. We need to stop and think about it and do the compassionate thing rather than the empathetic thing. He makes that differentiation. So I've saved, you can send me the money for the book now, actually, because I've saved you it. I'm not sure he really does get that much deeper than that in my reading. But it's a very good point that, and so much so that often the people who are involved in authoritarian cults are empaths. We met many of them there, and they become weaponized empaths, like Mike Rinder. He's a really nice guy, but he was weaponized. I suspect that Himmler, of all people, may have been a weaponized empath, though he founded the SS, was the head of it and the Gestapo, and ran the death camps. But when you look at his journals and his letters, he's really worried about the effect this is having on the poor SS men. You know, he's really worried about them. So there's an empathy there, that our presumptions about, you know, there are psychopaths and the rest of us. No, there are all sorts of complexities here. And I think probably the most dangerous thing is where decent, empathetic people are picked up and carried along by some idealism. When I looked at the Clinton campaign, which was borrowed and brought over here for New Labour, I was shocked to see how intensely manipulative these people were willing to be to win, you know, to get into power so they could do wonderful things. In his case, extraordinary rendition, you know, closing down welfare. I'm not a big Clinton fan, I must say. I'm generally not a fan of politicians and all of this.
I think I fall into that category of just not being a fan of politicians, because all I see is the manipulation and the control and the deception, and it all feels really cultic to me. And the way it's emerged now, you've got extremism. You've got people on right and left, and they're both extreme. There's very few in the middle who are just like, listen, this is our country. We need to manage this because, I've said to both my friends who are Republican or Democrats, I'm like, you know, if we go to war, they give guns to both Republicans and Democrats. Like, we're on the same side, but it's gotten out of hand, John. It's really it's terrible over here. I don't know what it's like in England now, but we are a country divided. It's really a catastrophe.
Yeah, I think we've largely survived the Cambridge Analytica aggregate IQ Robert and Becker Mercer imposition of Brexit here. It did cause horrific division, but because it can't, you know, it cannot persist in the same way that, you know, and that I just hope that the Democrats understand that the reason they lost to Trump was because they need to sort themselves out and need to become ethical. They need to stop the plutocracy, this whole idea of a bought democracy that's existed from George Washington to the present day through Tammany Hall and all of these things, and actually get rid of the corruption and all of the hypocrisy that maintains it. I mean, I remember when John Kerry was standing as president, that he had a marquee and you could go in and shake hands with him if you paid, I think it was $150,000. And you're going, this is preferment and it's not acceptable.
It isn't. It's, but I'm almost to the point of where I feel like even if you enter into that field with a positive approach, either you get squeezed out or you get corrupted. Like, I don't think you rise up without being corrupted, you know? And so it's like, how's there a solution if no one in the system, you know, hasn't been somehow been influenced and compromised on some level? So it's just, I can't get emotionally invested in it because I don't feel like anyone's ever really being honest. It's the same way I'm feeling about the news right now. I don't feel you get. I mean, I remember growing up with Walter Cronkite, who just seemed to tell the news. now everything's editorialized. It's always someone's opinion. There's always some angle.
Mm.
And so it's hard to know what's going on anywhere anymore. It's just, I don't know. I don't want to be fatalistic, but it's not something that I tune into the news every day because it just depresses me. I say, what's the point?
Mm.
I figure if something really awful is happening, someone will tell me, but I'm not going to take it in daily. I'm just not going to do it. It's not me. I've got better things to think about.
I've had long periods of my life where I disconnected from news events. I mean, as a kid, my dad used to wake up listening to a news bulletin. I was like, Dad, it's not going to cheer you up for the day. Listen to some music or something.
Right.
But he was not going to stop and carried on doing that. And seeing, the brainwashing of my dad, that you can dump somebody in Rush Limbaugh land and that they will be lost. So we are tremendously influenced by these things. I mean, we get RT over here, so we can flip from the BBC News, which is probably as straight as it does get, which is still not straight enough, through to Sky News, so we can get the Murdoch perspective on the world, through to RT, so we can find what the Russians are thinking. It's we used to have Al Jazeera as well. Sadly, they don't broadcast here anymore. I think the license was pulled, but it is difficult to get a perspective, especially in the US. It seems complex to an outsider because you basically have two right of center parties who are claiming that one is right wing and one is left wing, and they've got no idea what left and right wing mean.
Because that's so funny, because that's the same thing. I went to school there, as I said, for a year, and so I've got a lot of Brit friends, and they're like, "You don't know what the left is. You guys are both." And I'm like, "What?" They said, "No, we've got
read Rosa Luxemburg. Get some idea.
Socialism over here." I go, "No, you have no idea what you guys are clueless." Yeah.
And you get the historical process. The great Studs Terkel said he was standing at a bus stop one day and he heard two yuppies whining, and he turned on them and he said, "How many hours do you work a week?" And they said, 40, 45 or something. He said, "You do realize," they were whining about socialism. He said, "You do realize that the only reason that you're not working 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, is because of the trade unions, the socialist movement that finally forced the bosses to have health and safety and things like that going on. You have to have a dynamic that represents the workers. You have to have a dynamic, and again, we get into language. This is socialism, it's communism, it's labor, it's that and the other. No, everybody, it's democracy. It's where everybody's meant to have a say, it becomes crazy. But anyway, I think I've wandered us off the subject quite well now. Perhaps we should take a break and resume in a few weeks' time. And
I'd love that. Absolutely.
Yeah, this has been.
It's always such a pleasure to talk with you, John. And you're one of the good guys out there, and you've guided me towards some great information, and I just treasure our friendship, and I just I'm thankful that you're out here fighting a good fight in the way that you do.
Great, and likewise, I tremendously admire what you've done. You also you said something. It was the first thing I watched an interview you did with Steve Hassan a few years ago, and you said that you wore your cult membership as a badge of honor, and I'd just like to put that thought into the mix, that we've achieved something through what we experienced. We have been into the darkest part of the forest, and we've been wounded, and we've almost recovered from that.
It's a trophy worth holding on to, that I think crises in general proves up to us as an individual that we're a lot tougher than we give ourselves credit for. And that, I'm a firm believer that we're never put in a situation we can't handle. So if it's happening, you can figure it out, and just have to stay tough and sort through it all, and the answers will come. So
and find the right people to talk to. Find people who actually do care and don't have an agenda that they're trying to push. Great.
True.
Well,
terrific.
I'm Jon Atack. It's my guest, Hoyt Richards, and we thank you very much for watching.
you very much. Take care, John.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much.